They said Africa must negotiate to survive. That peace was a currency, and we were too poor to buy it. But what if survival demanded fire, not dialogue? What if the age of negotiation has finally ended? In the burning heart of the Sahel, a new doctrine was born, forged not in words, but in steel. That day, 100 supply trucks crossed the Bandi Mani axis under fire, not to make peace, but to prove that courage travels faster than fear. And as dust covered the horizon, something greater began, a whisper carried through the winds of Africa. The time of waiting is over. If you believe that freedom is not granted through promises, but earned through strength, stay with us until the end of this story. October 2025, the Sahel was no longer a land of waiting. Burkina Faso's 19th Battalion, led by Captain Lynx, escorted over 100 supply trucks through the Bandi Mani axis, dismantling hidden explosives laid by JNIM terrorists. In Mali, airstrikes decapitated a major terrorist command. And far to the south, Nigeria's armies fought two different wars, one disciplined, one disordered. Across the continent, a new truth emerged. Those who negotiate fall, those who stand fight. But behind these victories, something larger was forming. A law written not in treaties, but in overwhelming firepower. They say the strongest weapons are not forged in factories, but in conviction. In the Sahel, the law of overwhelming firepower was not just a doctrine, it was a declaration. When Burkina Faso's convoy reached the deadly stretch of Bandi Mani, the road was more than a route, it was a test of destiny. Beneath the sand, for IEDs lay in wait like ghosts of a colonial shadow, a final message from those who still believed fear could reign over Africa. But this time, fear was outgunned. The engineers moved with surgical precision, their hands steady, their eyes fixed on the wires buried beneath the scorched earth. They dismantled the traps one by one. In silence broken only by the crackle of radios and the whisper of desert wind, Captain Lynx stood tall at the center of the formation, scanning the horizon with calm defiance. Behind him, 100 trucks stretched toward the edge of the desert, each one carrying more than supplies. They carried a nation's will. "We are not here to negotiate," Lynx said over the comms. "We are here to remind them, Africa does not bow twice." And when the final vehicle rolled past the last detonator, untouched, the desert itself seemed to exhale. A silence spread across the dunes. Vast and clean, as if the earth itself acknowledged the shift. For the first time in years, the road to Bandi Mani was clear, and so was the message: there will be no peace without victory. That same day, hundreds of kilometers away, a thunderclap echoed above Oro in Mali. A surgical strike, planned under the new doctrine of the AES Joint Command, annihilated a terrorist stronghold that had haunted the region for months. The Western advisors watching from afar called it reckless, but the people on the ground called it justice. The Malian flag was raised once again over the ruins, fluttering in a wind that no longer carried the stench of submission. The AES alliance, once dismissed as a fragile experiment, had evolved into a machine of willpower. Its creed was simple, brutal, and righteous: we do not negotiate with those who trade death for power. For decades, the Sahel had begged for peace through foreign intermediaries, and every promise of security had been paid for with a new massacre. The cycle was over. In Ouagadougou, Traoré's words became a mantra repeated in schools, military academies, and even in the markets: peace without strength is just a pause before defeat. It was more than rhetoric, it was strategy. Because for the first time, Africa was beginning to define peace on its own terms. The convoys no longer moved with fear. They moved with rhythm. Each soldier knew that behind his rifle stood an idea, the idea that sovereignty was no longer negotiable. Each bullet fired, each bridge repaired, each checkpoint cleared was part of something larger, a continental awakening. The law of overwhelming firepower was not about destruction. It was about clarity. It said to every warlord, every mercenary, every foreign hand that thought Africa could still be divided, this land is no longer yours to manipulate. But there was another layer to this doctrine. One few outsiders understood. It was not only about military dominance, it was psychological emancipation. In the Old World, Africans had been told that their survival depended on submission. That they needed permission to defend themselves. The AES shattered that lie. They proved that strength was not arrogance, it was responsibility. That self-defense was not a crime, it was a right. In Bamako's military academies, cadets began studying not just tactics, but purpose. They learned that the first battlefield is always the mind. If you cannot believe in your right to exist, their instructors said, you will lose before the first shot is fired. In classrooms across Burkina Faso, children repeated new lessons. Not colonial dates, not foreign kings, but the words of their own soldiers. We don't beg for peace. We build it. They learned that sovereignty begins with self-discipline, that courage is the foundation of stability. Teachers told them, the greatest fortress is not made of walls, it is made of conviction. And as the new generation grew under the banners of unity and resilience, the old order trembled. Those who had once controlled the narrative began to lose their grip. Western media called the Sahel unstable. But the people of the Sahel called it awakening. Because for the first time in decades, their fate was not being written in Paris or Washington, it was being written in Bandimani, in Gao, in Niamey, in the dust and blood of their own soil. Still, even in victory, the AES leaders remained cautious. They knew this struggle was not over. The enemies of independence no longer wore uniforms, they wore suits. They spoke the language of diplomacy but acted in the shadows of sabotage. They tried to cut off supplies, blockade, isolate governments. But Africa had already learned the hardest lesson of all, that dependence is the slowest form of defeat. Across the alliance, a new philosophy spread, we do not wait for support. We build capacity. Farmers learned to produce local fuel. Engineers built their own drones. Coders designed homegrown encryption. Economists began drafting a shared financial framework to escape the colonial currencies that chained their markets. The law of overwhelming firepower had evolved beyond the battlefield, it had become a social, technological, and spiritual doctrine. It was about overwhelming dependency with innovation, overwhelming despair with purpose, overwhelming fragmentation with unity. If you believe that the courage of these men and women is more than a story, if you feel that Africa's strength is rising again from its own soil, then speak it. Write it, share it. Because every word is another spark, a signal that the world is watching not a crisis, but a rebirth. As the sun sank behind the dunes of Bandimani, Captain Lynx climbed atop the final truck and looked back down the road they had cleared. He could still smell the dust, the fuel, the metal, but beneath it all was something purer, the scent of dignity reclaimed. He raised his hand toward the horizon, where the convoy disappeared into the light. This, he whispered, is what freedom smells like. And as the wind carried his words across the desert, the silence of the Sahel was no longer empty. It was sacred. Far from the dunes of the Sahel, across the Indian Ocean, another fire was quietly igniting. In Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar, people no longer spoke with fear, they whispered with fury. The empire had returned, not with muskets, but with money, media, and manipulation. And yet, on that island once called the Red Continent's Mirror, a new reflection was forming, Africa was no longer for sale. The breaking point came when President Rajoelina attempted to placate Paris once again, agreeing to economic partnerships that smelled more like surrender. He stood on television and called it a new era of cooperation. But the people saw the old colonial mask beneath the smile. They remembered the droughts while France took their vanilla and nickel. They remembered the hunger while Europe praised Madagascar's growth. That night, students took to the streets. Farmers abandoned their fields to march on the capital. From the northern ports to the southern plains, a single cry rose, we will not be a colony disguised as a democracy. And somewhere in the chaos, a voice, hoarse but resolute, declared over a smuggled transmitter. I am in a safe place to protect my life and my family. But I remain the legitimate president of Madagascar. What is happening today is not a popular revolution, it is an illegal seizure of power. The statement hit like a thunderclap. The world hesitated. Was it Rajolina speaking, or the ghost of the people he betrayed? The streets answered before the news did. Protest banners carried one phrase, "Goodbye, France." It was not a slogan. It was a sentence passed by history. Madagascar had seen this before, the coups, the promises, the international silence. But this time, something was different. The island was no longer isolated. It had heard the echo from Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. The youth knew the names of Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani as if they were their own brothers. AES had become not just an alliance, it was a compass. In the alleys of Antananarivo, graffiti appeared overnight, "The continent is one." On social media, hashtags multiplied faster than censors could delete them. From the villages to the coast, people began whispering a phrase that terrified the old guard: Madagascar will join the new Africa. France, cornered by its own arrogance, sent envoys disguised as mediators. They spoke of dialogue and stability. But the people no longer wanted dialogue, they wanted deliverance. In the east, fishermen refused to sell seafood to French vessels. In the highlands, teachers began rewriting history lessons, teaching children about sovereignty, not subservience. And in the capital, a group of young officers, inspired by AES, issued a statement: "We will not protect a regime that kneels." The regime faltered. The foreign embassies panicked. For the first time, Paris could not predict the outcome. It was no longer a game of diplomacy, it was a reckoning. Across Africa, the news spread like wildfire. Madagascar rises. Headlines read in Bamako and Ouagadougou. AES soldiers, watching from their outposts, nodded silently. They understood that every island, every desert, every forest was part of the same storm. Because the truth was undeniable, the fall of one puppet regime was not an isolated event, it was a signal that the colonial script was being rewritten. When Rajolina fled the palace, the crowd didn't loot, they sang. They sang the old songs of independence, long banned from public squares. And when the sun rose the next morning over the Indian Ocean, the flag of Madagascar flew freely, not as a symbol of rebellion, but of return. Africa was returning to itself. The AES communiqué later issued a simple, calm statement. The liberation of Madagascar is the liberation of us all. No African land will stand alone again. Those words traveled farther than any bullet. From Cairo to Harare, from Addis Ababa to Dakar, a new sense of pride stirred. The continent was rediscovering its unity, not through speeches, but through synchronization, of courage, of destiny, of truth. And as the wind carried news of Madagascar's uprising across the continent, the Sahel remembered its own oath, that Africa would not only resist, but rebuild. Because this was never about isolation. It was about ignition. A match struck in Antananarivo could light the heart of Africa. And in that fire, the empire's shadow began to fade. One country, two wars, one of courage, one of confusion. Nigeria, the giant of Africa, now looked into a mirror that showed two faces. In the south, the face of strength, coordinated, sharp, and resolute. In the north, the face of hesitation, chaotic, tired, and broken. How could one nation breathe with such uneven lungs? How could a single army march in opposite directions at the same time? The contradiction was not only military. It was moral. In Imo and Anambra, soldiers operated with the precision of a scalpel. They hunted, captured, and neutralized insurgents linked to IPOB. Gentle the Yahoo, once a shadow of terror, was dragged from his hideout after a week of coordinated intelligence. Southern commanders stood proud, their troops were well-equipped, well-trained, and disciplined. The government praised the Southern efficiency, as if security were a product of geography. But further north, the story turned darker. In Kaduna, Zamfara, and Niger states, the land burned with another kind of war, one without order, without mercy. Villages disappeared overnight. Farmers whispered prayers before dawn, knowing they might not see the sunset. Mothers buried sons who had joined the army without uniforms, fathers carried daughters across rivers to escape abduction. The word bandit became too small to describe the horror. Soldiers in the north spoke of broken trucks, empty fuel tanks, and weapons older than themselves. They fought enemies armed with brand new rifles, imported by unknown routes. A lieutenant said quietly, "We are defending a country that negotiates with the people we fight." That was the heart of the contradiction. The policy of peace through compromise had turned into a policy of peace through surrender. The defense chief tried to draw a line: do not make peace deals with bandits. They will never honor them. But as his voice echoed across the radio waves, another governor, far in the north, was signing one. Papers, pens, and handshakes, while gunfire echoed outside the window. Each truce bought silence, but not safety. Each negotiation planted the seed of a future ambush. Bandits learned the rhythm of the government: shoot for attention, negotiate for money, retreat, reload. The people, caught in between, stopped believing in both sides. A market woman in Katsina said, "The government speaks peace only when it cannot protect." A teacher replied, "And the soldiers die for promises written on paper." The contrast with the AES states was brutal. In Mali and Burkina Faso, there were no deals, only determination. They did not negotiate with those who attacked their people. They believed peace could only be built through victory. Nigeria, however, remained trapped between democracy's caution and insurgency's cruelty. Then came Kebbi. A single-state governor, tired of waiting for help from Abuja, took matters into his own hands. He signed a secret agreement with a Chinese security firm to fight the Lakurawa terrorist group. Drones, logistics, and training, all promised under a private contract. To the people, it felt like salvation. To the generals, it felt like mutiny. Can a governor hire foreign fighters without national approval? Can a subnational government outsource sovereignty? These were not just legal questions, they were existential. The military's chain of command trembled under the weight of divided authority. In the skies of Kebbi, foreign drones began to fly, white, silent, mechanical witnesses. Villagers pointed upward, confused. Children called them the eyes of China. For the first time, the Nigerian flag no longer symbolized monopoly of force. International news outlets framed it as innovation in counterterrorism. But inside Nigeria, it was a confession that the central state had lost faith in its own capacity. In Lagos cafes, analysts debated the ethics. In Abuja, the National Assembly murmured about legality. But in Sokoto's dusty streets, nobody cared about policy. They cared about survival. The Kebbi deal revealed a new pattern: when nations hesitate, others step in. The vacuum of governance attracts not peace, but influence. Meanwhile, the Southern Army celebrated its latest victory: another captured insurgent, another televised handshake. The headlines read, "Government delivers peace to the people." But behind every success story was a silence from the north, a silence heavy with unmarked graves. The moral wound deepened. A divided army cannot protect a divided nation. Nigeria's dual identity, half strength, half surrender, reflected the deeper sickness of a system unwilling to choose between confrontation and compromise. And beyond its borders, the world was watching. The AES generals in Mali and Burkina Faso analyzed Nigeria's predicament like a mirror they refused to break. They saw what would have happened if they had chosen negotiation. For them, Nigeria was not just a neighbor, it was a warning. If you believe that justice cannot be negotiated, share your thoughts below. Because in the war for sovereignty, neutrality is complicity. As October's heat settled over the Sahel and Gulf of Guinea alike, one message rose above all noise: Africa's peace cannot be purchased. It must be built through strength. In the deserts of the Sahel, victory often comes wrapped in silence. But in late October 2025, that silence cracked open. Burkina's engineers, while dismantling a captured JNIM convoy near Kolu, found crates not marked with Arabic letters, but with barcodes, serials, and manufacturing stamps that led back to the ports of the Gulf of Guinea. The cargo trail was not a mystery of jihad. It was a map of power. Those containers had once passed through hands that spoke French, signed contracts in Mandarin, and shipped under Russian insurance. It was not one nation arming the terrorists, it was the chaos of global ambition. Every actor, chasing influence in Africa's heart, had turned the Sahel into a chessboard, where each fallen soldier was just another pawn in someone else's endgame. But the AES commanders saw through the illusion. They realized that every time the Sahel bled, someone's stock price rose; every time a peace deal was signed, another loan was secured; every time a convoy exploded, new weapons were ordered in the name of counterterrorism. It was not ideology, it was business. And business was booming. That was when the new doctrine took shape, the law of self-reliance. No more dependence on foreign training programs. No more peacekeeper intermediaries, no more contracts that came with hidden chains. The AES began to build its own logistics, its own armories, its own communications network independent of satellite routes leased by Western firms. They did not trust the language of partnership anymore, they trusted the language of proof. In the dark rooms of Ouagadougou's command center, a single order was written on the board. Track every weapon, and trace it to its port. What they found shocked even their allies. The same shipping company that supplied humanitarian aid in southern Nigeria was also listed as a subcontractor for a Chinese mining firm in Kebbi State, and had handled the same batch of metal containers found in terrorist caches across the border. Coincidence? Or something deeper, a game of shadow economies played across fragile states? As AES soldiers advanced through the dunes, journalists began to ask the forbidden question. Who really arms Africa? The answer was not written in reports or press briefings, it was written in the scars of every soldier who fought with obsolete weapons against enemies holding imported rifles. One night, under the Sahelian sky, an AES soldier looked up and whispered. We learned to build peace from strength. And for the first time, the continent's silence did not sound like fear, it sounded like awakening. If this spirit touches your heart, like, comment, and subscribe, so that together, we keep Africa's fire of freedom burning. They used to say Africa needed help to stand. Now, Africa stands like steel. From the dunes of the Sahel to the ports of the Atlantic, from Cairo to Cape Town, a new rhythm beats beneath the continent's skin, the rhythm of self-made sovereignty. No longer built on borrowed strength, no longer waiting for permission. This is the age of steel and spirit, forged by those who refuse to kneel, shaped by those who chose to rise. Every border defended, every field reclaimed, every factory reborn is a declaration that the African century will not be negotiated, it will be built. And the world will learn that peace imposed from abroad collapses. But peace forged in fire endures. Now, the flags of the AES flutter against the dawn wind. Drums echo in unison. And the continent, once divided by fear, now moves as one will. One heart, one purpose. Now it's our turn, to keep that flame burning.